Flaxborough's mornings were not the sort that hurried. Even the chimneys gave up their smoke reluctantly, as if rising into the day required an effort best postponed until after the first post. And so it was, at precisely 10 past 10 on a dull Thursday, that Mrs. Gladys Trimble's tea morning at number 12, Welkin Street, achieved the only distinction it would ever know. It became a matter for the police. Mrs. Trimble was the kind of woman who measured social life in teaspoons. She kept 3 kinds of biscuits, all of which she pretended to resent purchasing, and she possessed a teapot so old and elaborate that guests felt obliged to praise it before sipping a drop. It had belonged, she said, to a minor cousin of a bishop, which in Flaxborough made it almost royal. Her 4 guests were seated about the lace-covered table, Mrs. Lintot, who always wore lilac and spoke as though the room was slightly deaf; Miss Gudgeon, a retired postmistress with a mind like a ledger; Mrs. Cora Pashley, who had opinions on everything and was never wrong; and, finally, Miss Ivy Groom, who worked at the drapery and was invited chiefly because Mrs. Trimble thought it uplifting to have someone young present. The morning began, as it always did, conversation about garden pests and the shocking price of tea, followed by mild scandal concerning the vicar's sermon length. But the comfort of routine was broken when Miss Groom, in the act of taking her cup, gave a small gasp, turned pale, and slid sideways off her chair. There was, of course, a short period of confusion, in which Mrs. Pashley fetched the smelling salts, Mrs. Lintot shouted, "Water!" and Mrs. Trimble fretted over the carpet. Within minutes the girl revived, embarrassed, apologetic, insisting she had missed breakfast, that's all. But as she dabbed at her forehead, it was noticed, with tragic precision, that the famous bishop's teapot was no longer on the tray. "Gone!" gasped Mrs. Trimble, her hand fluttering near her pearls. It was indeed gone. Teacups trembled, conversation faltered, and a mild panic set in. By 11 o'clock Mrs. Pashley had conveyed the tale, in strictest confidence, to her cousin at the library, and by 12:30 the librarian had happened to mention it to a constable purchasing a stamp. The constable, being of conscientious mind and partial to Mrs. Trimble's sponge cake, reported the matter to Sergeant Love, who, to his credit, raised an eyebrow and said, "Well, it's not the Brinks mat, is it?" Nevertheless, by early afternoon, Inspector Purbright had the incident neatly penciled into his daybook between lost bicycle chain, Mrs. E. Frobisher, and complaint, dog fouling, church close. When Purbright arrived at number 12, Mrs. Trimble was in full indignation. She received him in the parlour, standing as though she expected a camera crew. "I should like it clearly understood, Inspector, that I am not in the habit of losing property," she began, "particularly not ecclesiastical property." Purbright smiled mildly. "Quite so, madam. The teapot? Perhaps you could describe it?" It was silver, with engraving, and a slight dent from the bishop's nephew's accident. "It's been in the family for generations." "Indeed," said Purbright. "And you're quite certain it was present when you poured the tea?" "Absolutely certain. Mrs. Pashley admired it, didn't you, Cora?" Mrs. Pashley, seated stiffly, nodded. "A most distinguished pot. Though I always say silver gives the tea a queer tang." Purbright's gaze moved slowly around the room, over the tidy carpet, the fainted girl now recovered and blushing, the tray, and a small residue of spilled leaves on the hearth. He asked no further questions, only remarked, "An unfortunate morning for tea, it seems." "Do you think it was stolen?" whispered Miss Groom timidly. Purbright considered. "If it has not misplaced itself, that would appear to be the next explanation." At which Mrs. Trimble drew herself up and declared that Flaxborough is not the sort of place where things vanish without reason. Purbright, who knew precisely how wrong that statement was, inclined his head with quiet courtesy. "No, indeed, madam. In Flaxborough, everything happens with reason, though rarely the one we expect." Outside, as he returned to his car, the inspector glanced once more at the neat row of houses, all prim and uniform, each concealing its quota of discontent and china. He had the faint sense that Mrs. Trimble's teapot was only the beginning, a trivial object in a larger, more human entanglement. Something about Miss Groom's sudden fainting, the precise timing, and the neatly gathered tea leaves on the floor struck him as too convenient for coincidence. He made a note in his small book, number 12. Welkin Street, teapot, fainting, tea leaves, check composition. Then added, almost as an afterthought, Mrs. Trimble. Watch tone when speaking of clergy. In the police car, Sergeant Love turned the ignition and asked cheerfully, "So, nicked teapot, sir. You think it's that girl? They're saying she's short of rent." Purbright looked out of the window, watching a cat stalk along the garden wall. "I think," he said quietly, "we shall let the town decide for a day or two. It does the groundwork rather well." And as the motor hummed down Welkin Street, Flaxborough's first small mystery of the season began to steep, as all good ones did, in a pot of gossip. By Friday morning, the affair of the missing teapot had expanded to dimensions wholly inconsistent with its weight in silver. The ladies of Flaxborough had taken it upon themselves to ensure that no version of events went under-discussed. The tale had begun in Mrs. Trimble's parlour, but by the time it reached the baker's queue it involved arsenic, an argument, and at least one mysterious visitor seen leaving by the side gate. It was at the church porch, however, where the story achieved its fullest flowering. The porch served as the town's unofficial newsroom, particularly between 10:30 and 11, when those just passing by seemed remarkably numerous. Mrs. Lintott, proud possessor of the latest information, was found leaning conspiratorially toward Mrs. Pashley, her voice a tremulous whisper that carried admirably in the morning stillness. "Of course," she murmured. "The doctor said it was a fainting fit, but they don't say what caused it, do they? And what sort of girl faints just from tea, unless it was, well, something in it?" Mrs. Pashley's brows rose in slow, deliberate horror. "You don't mean poison?" "I wouldn't dream of saying that," said Mrs. Lintott, whose dreams were invariably of saying precisely such things. "But one must admit, it's odd." Miss Groom alone with the tray, Mrs. Trimble out of the room for just a moment, and then collapse. A passing verger, having caught fragments of this, nodded gravely and carried the news along to the greengrocer's wife, who added that she had heard the poor girl had been ill for weeks. Within the hour, a sympathetic version emerged. Miss Groom, a delicate soul, had fainted under stress brought on by wrongful accusation. It was a small mercy, perhaps, that Miss Groom herself knew nothing of this as she arranged ribbons on the drapery window, acutely aware of eyes that lingered longer than usual. At the police station, Sergeant Love was delighted by the town's industry. "They'll have the case solved by tea time," he said, producing a fresh report from his in-tray. "Someone's written in saying they saw a man in a dark coat near number 12 that morning. Could be something." Purbright, seated at his desk with a cup of indifferent coffee, regarded the note without expression. "Indeed, the man in the dark coat, remarkably reliable figure. He turns up in every scandal between here and Ely." Love grinned. "You don't think there's anything to it?" "I think," said Purbright, "that if everyone in Flaxborough who owns a dark coat is suspect, we may as well lock up the council." He closed the report, leaned back, and let a moment's quiet settle. Still, the town is doing what it does best. It's fermenting. Sooner or later, truth will rise to the top, though not necessarily pure. By mid-afternoon, truth had risen in several incompatible forms. The postmistress declared the theft an inside job. The vicar's wife confided that it must have been a prank, and a young clerk at the bank was heard insisting it had something to do with an insurance policy. Each new explanation gained immediate acceptance until displaced by a fresher one. Mrs. Trimble, meanwhile, had installed herself as both victim and curator of the affair. Her drawing-room had become a kind of museum of injustice, where she received callers beneath the stern portrait of the bishop's cousin. Her visitors expressed outrage in tones of deep satisfaction, for outrage in Flaxborough was both an art and a pleasure. "I'm told," she announced to Mrs. Pashley, and a perspiring Mr. Harby of the council, "that some people are hinting my poor little gathering was, how shall I put it, unwholesome." "Disgraceful gossip, madam," declared Mr. Harby, who had privately repeated the same hint at least twice. "The police should act." Purbright, arriving discreetly moments later, was met with this suggestion. "Ah, Inspector," Mrs. Dowie Trimble exclaimed, "we have just been saying the very same. Surely you have some leads?" The inspector's face, habitually mild, betrayed nothing more than patient interest. "Leads, madam, are rather like rhubarb. They appear when they're ready, and forcing them is seldom productive." Mrs. Trimble, uncertain whether she had been reassured or rebuked, pressed her handkerchief to her bosom. "Then you believe there is something amiss?" Purbright's eyes wandered briefly to the sideboard, where a faint circular mark on the lace runner indicated where the teapot had stood. "I believe," he said, "that teapots do not often vanish entirely of their own accord. But people, Mrs. Trimble, people are wonderfully inventive in helping them along." When he left, he walked the short distance to the church where the porch had emptied, but the echo of conversation remained, as tangible as the scent of polish on the pews. He paused a moment, looking out at the market square, the slow rhythm of lives proceeding as usual, yet subtly rearranged by the day's talking. He thought of Miss Groom's pale face, the spilled tea leaves, the deliberate neatness of that household. The town, he reflected, was engaged in building its own version of truth. His task, as ever, would be to discover which part of the structure would quietly collapse first. And as the bells marked the hour, Purbright turned back toward the station, knowing that by evening there would be yet another rumour, perhaps the most interesting one yet, waiting in his in-tray. Saturday dawned, with the kind of indecisive weather that perfectly suited Flaxborough's mood, grey enough to seem serious, mild enough to encourage idleness. Inspector Purbright, who preferred his mornings to begin in the company of facts rather than opinions, found himself once again at number 12 Welkin Street. It was his habit, when a matter showed signs of becoming social, to re-enter the scene quietly, before the town's collective memory rearranged it altogether. Mrs. Trimble answered the door in a robe of mauve flannel that might have been intended for morning or breakfast, and greeted him with a composure that trembled on the edge of theatre. "Inspector, I cannot tell you how relieved I am to see the law taking a real interest. We've all felt rather unsafe," Purbright nodded sympathetically. "I quite understand, madam. May I trouble you once more for a few details? These early clarifications often save confusion later." She ushered him into the parlour, which had been rearranged in such a way as to emphasize absence, the tray newly polished, the sideboard gleaming a single fresh rose where the teapot had once sat. It was, Purbright thought, an impressive effort in visual guilt management. "Now," he began gently, notebook open, "on the morning in question you recall stepping out for a moment?" "Only to fetch the seed catalogue from the hall table," said Mrs. Trimble, clasping her hands. I left them talking perfectly civilly. Miss Groom was by the tray, Mrs. Pashley and the others seated. I was gone less than a minute. And when you returned? Well, Ivy had fainted. Poor thing. Her cup was overturned, and the pot gone. Did anyone else approach the table? Not that I saw. Though, she added, lowering her voice, Mrs. Lintott is a nervous woman. She may have moved things about to help. Purbright wrote a line and then asked, You've known Miss Groom long? She came to the drapery 2 years ago. Quite respectable, but, well, you know the young. She keeps herself to herself, which I've always found a little suspicious. Suspicious, Mrs. Trimble? In a Christian sense, she explained hastily. We're told to be open, are we not? Purbright closed the notebook. Thank you. That's most helpful. He left with the sense that Mrs. Trimble's grief for her teapot would last precisely until something more flattering replaced it. At the drapery, Miss Groom was arranging bolts of fabric with careful, almost penitential attention. She started when she saw him, then coloured faintly. Inspector, oh, I hope there's no more trouble. None at all. Miss Groom, only tidying the loose threads, as it were. He allowed himself a small smile, which failed to ease her. She confessed she remembered little of the moment itself. Just a sudden dizziness, the sound of voices, and then Mrs. Pashley calling her name. I didn't take it, sir, she said suddenly, before he had even asked. I wouldn't dream Mrs. Trimble's been so kind. Purbright studied her expression. Fear, yes, but something else too, humiliation perhaps, or anxiety born of being pitied. No one's accusing you, he said, though I wonder, had anything been troubling you beforehand? You'd eaten little, I'm told. I hadn't slept, she admitted. There've been letters? Silly ones. No name? Just things like you'll get what's coming, or everyone knows now. I tore them up. I didn't think... She broke off, twisting the tape measure in her hands. Did you keep any? No, sir. He thanked her and stepped back into the narrow street. The faint drizzle had begun again, dampening the window boxes and flattening the day's energy into routine. His next call was to Mrs. Cora Pashley, who lived in a square of houses recently renamed the Cedars by collective delusion. She received him amid a confusion of porcelain dogs. I told everyone from the start, she declared, that girl's story didn't ring true. A feint? Pah, a performance if ever I saw one. And those letters, probably written by herself to gain sympathy. Young women do that sort of thing. They've been encouraged by television. Purbright regarded the dogs, whose faces seemed permanently aghast. You have a sharp eye, Mrs. Pashley. Did you notice anything else unusual? Anything missing besides the teapot? She pursed her lips. Only Mrs. Trimble's good sense. Inviting shopgirls to her home. Next, she'll be feeding stray cats at the table. He thanked her too, though without visible enthusiasm. Back at the station, he found Sergeant Love examining a parcel. Forensics from the yard, sir. Bit of silver residue on the tray. Old polish, nothing more. Oh, and a letter turned up at the post office. Addressed to Miss Groom, no sender's name. Purbright unfolded the envelope. The paper was cheap, the handwriting feminine but stiff, the message brief. You'll be sorry for what you've done. No signature, no date. When was this handed in? Yesterday morning, before we got the report. Interesting. He studied the postmark. Local. You know, love, I begin to suspect that our missing teapot may be serving a purpose larger than refreshment. Love frowned. A frame-up? Possibly. Or a message. People often express resentment through objects they can remove or destroy. Safer than honesty. That afternoon, Purbright took a quiet detour along Welkin Street, noting how curtains twitched with choreographed innocence. Opposite number 12 lived Mr. Clitheroe, retired insurance man and chronic watcher of windows. Purbright raised a hand in greeting. Morning, Mr. Clitheroe. You've an admirable view of events in this street. The man adjusted his spectacles, flattered. That I have, Inspector. Saw you at Mrs. Trimble's just now. Dreadful business, dreadful. Though between you and me, she's always liked a fuss. Had the gas board out 3 times last month for a smell that wasn't there. Purbright smiled faintly. I suppose you didn't notice any strangers about on Thursday? Strangers? Oh, there was a van painted green. Gardeners, I think. Parked opposite for 10 minutes or so. but they drove off before 11. Gardeners, Purbright repeated. Did they call at number 12? Not that I saw. He thanked the man and walked on, making a mental note. A green van, a fainting, a theft that might not be theft at all. He had the shape of a puzzle without its edges. As dusk began to settle over Flaxborough, Purbright sat once more at his desk. The town outside grew quiet, as though even gossip required rest. On the blotter before him lay 3 fragments, a missing teapot, an unsigned letter, and a girl who had fainted precisely when she needed to appear helpless. He wrote a single line across the page. Objects vanish. Motives seldom do. Then he closed the notebook, satisfied that tomorrow's questions would require more than politeness to answer. By Monday morning, Flaxborough had concluded the matter with its usual efficiency. The missing teapot, the fainting girl, and the anonymous letters had all been woven into a single, comfortable narrative, one that made moral sense, which was more important to the town than factual sense. Sergeant Love, armed with this distilled public wisdom, presented it to Inspector Purbright over tea and an uncompromising doughnut. "It's the cleaner, sir," he said, with satisfaction. Miss Trimble's new one. "Only started a fortnight ago. Name of Elsie Holt. Bit of a past. Took a fiver once from a till in Bingham." Trimble's too soft-hearted to check references properly. "You know the type. Looks honest, smells of disinfectant." Purbright looked up from his cup. "And where, pray, does the fainting come in?" "Well, that's the clever part. Miss Groom sees her take the teapot, gets a shock, and swoons. Or maybe Elsie slipped something in the tea to distract everyone. Bit of sleeping powder, nothing dangerous. The teapot goes into her bag, out the door. Job done." "Neat, isn't it?" "Very neat," said Purbright, who always distrusted neatness. He leaned back, fingers loosely interlaced. "And what does Mrs. Holt say?" "Denies it, of course. Claims she left before the party started. But she's nervous. Keeps looking at her shoes. I bet £1 she's hiding something." "People who clean for a living," said Purbright mildly, "often look at their shoes." "Occupational habit," Love grinned, but the inspector's expression didn't alter. After a pause, Purbright said, "Fetch her in, would you? Let's see what her shoes have to say." Mrs. Holt was a square-built woman of about 50, with an expression permanently arranged to ward off disappointment. She sat in the interview chair as if it were another form of kitchen stool and faced Purbright with wary civility. "I've nothing to do with it, sir," she said firmly. "I was out by 9:30. Mrs. Trimble's lot don't start their fussing till 10. Ask anyone. Where were you after that?" "Doing the vicarage windows, they'll tell you." "I've not the slightest use for silver, too much polishing." Purbright nodded. "Ah, quite so. And you didn't notice anything odd at number 12 before you left?" "Only Mrs. Trimble herself. Kept moving things from one sideboard to another. Said it showed the grain better." "I reckon she'd lose her own nose if it weren't stuck on." There was no malice in the tone, merely professional weariness. Purbright thanked her, released her, and watched as she walked down the corridor, head high, step firm. Not the gait of a thief, he thought, though he had learned long ago that guilt wore many shoes. When Love returned, expecting an arrest, he found Purbright by the window, gazing across the station yard. "She's clean, isn't she?" the sergeant said with disappointment. "She's unconvincing as a criminal, yes," Purbright replied. "But she may still be useful to someone who is," a frown. Meaning the person who took the teapot needed a narrative that wouldn't stick to themselves. Mrs. Holt's little past is perfect wallpaper. And the town, well, it's done half the work for them. He turned back to the desk, flipping open his notes. Let's review. The girl faints, the pot vanishes, and Miss Groom receives letters implying guilt. Who benefits from that arrangement? Love thought, chewing a pencil. Mrs. Trimble? She likes a scene. Too visible, said Purbright. She wouldn't risk the loss of admiration that comes with exposure. She wants to suffer publicly, not confess privately, Love nodded, defeated. So we've no real suspect. On the contrary, Purbright said quietly. We have several, Only we don't yet know what the crime really is. Later that afternoon, Councillor Harby came to the station with his own contribution to the theory pool. He was a man of fixed opinions and unfixed integrity, and he entered with the air of one expecting applause. "Inspector, I've been thinking," he began, "and it's quite clear what's happened. Insurance. Trimble's teapot was overvalued for sentimental reasons. Now it's gone missing, she can claim the full amount." Very tidy little arrangement. Purbright looked at him with mild interest. "You suggest Mrs. Trimble arranged her own theft?" "Well, one hears things," said Harby, puffing his chest. "And I happen to know her policy's up for renewal next month. Convenient timing." "Thank you, Councillor," Purbright said pleasantly. "I'll be sure to take your insights into account." When the man had gone, Love muttered, "He'd sell his grandmother's umbrella for a headline." Purbright made a non-committal sound. "Perhaps, but sometimes even the self-serving stumble across something true. It may not be insurance, but motive seldom lies far from self-interest." As evening fell, Purbright sat alone with the evidence spread before him. A faded photograph of the missing teapot, the anonymous letter, and the faint trace of tea leaves he had taken from the hearth. He placed them side by side like actors waiting for their lines. Outside, Flaxborough's lamps flickered into life, illuminating curtains drawn against curiosity. Somewhere among those curtained windows, he thought, someone was congratulating themselves on a job well done. And that, he reflected, was always the most dangerous stage of any deception, the moment when cleverness mistakes itself for safety. He wrote in his notebook, "Theory neat, reality seldom is. Investigate timing, not talk." Then he closed it, pocketed his pen, and decided that tomorrow he would revisit number 12. Not to question, but to listen. In Flaxborough, listening was usually enough to make the guilty shift their teacups just a fraction too fast. The next morning began with drizzle again, Flaxborough's favourite method of keeping ambition in check. Inspector Purbright walked slowly along Welkin Street, collar turned up, the damp pressing lightly against his hat brim. He had no intention of confronting anyone, not yet. He simply wanted to see, hear, and smell the place as it truly was when no one expected to be watched. The smell, for instance, was of boiled cabbage, furniture polish, and that faint metallic tang that accompanies houses where small deceptions are stored like preserves. Mrs. Trimble's curtains were open this time. Through the glass, he saw her arranging flowers in a vase, lips pursed, posture precise. Her performance continued even when no one applauded. He noted it quietly, then made his way to the back gate, where he found something odd, a faint scatter of dried tea leaves near the sill of the scullery window. Not spilled but placed. A small pinch, as if tested and discarded. He bent, examined them, and rubbed a fragment between thumb and forefinger. Still faintly aromatic, not the blend she'd used at the table. It was sharper, almost medicinal. When Mrs. Trimble appeared in the doorway, startled by his silhouette, she clutched her apron to her chest. "Inspector!" "You gave me the fright of my life." "My apologies, madam," he said mildly. "I was admiring your kitchen window. You do a great deal of tea-making, I imagine?" "Constantly. Can't abide plain water." He pointed to the sill. "And this blend, do you use it often?" She peered down, frowned, and said too quickly, "Goodness, no. That's old sweepings, probably." "I've been tidying." "Indeed?" He let the word rest a moment. "Tell me, Mrs. Trimble, who usually brings the tea from the pantry?" "I do, unless Ivy helps." "She's a dear, really. Misguided, perhaps, but gentle." Said Purbright. "And where is the pantry?" She led him to a narrow door beside the stove. Inside were tins, neatly labelled Ceylon, Darjeeling, Broken Pekoe. Only one tin was half full, and unlike the others, its lid bore faint scratches. Recent ones, Purbright thought. He picked it up. "You buy in bulk, I see. My cousin sends it from London." Such a thoughtful man. "And does he always send the same blend?" She hesitated. "Usually, though." Come to think of it, this last lot tasted different. I assumed it had gone stale. Purbright replaced the tin. Tea seldom goes stale unless it's meant to. Her mouth opened slightly as if to reply, then closed again. She seemed to decide that polite confusion was safer than curiosity. Later, back at the station, Purbright placed the few remaining grains from the sill into a paper envelope and sealed it. "I'd get these to Dr. Hargreaves," he told Love. "He's fond of experiments." "Tell him not to drink it, whatever it is." Love raised an eyebrow. "You think she's been tampering with it?" "Or someone else?" "I think," said Purbright, "that tea is rather like truth. It takes heat to bring out what's hidden." By afternoon, the doctor's report arrived. No poison, but traces of valerian and chamomile. A mild sedative mixture, harmless in small quantities, though quite capable of making one faint. "Herbal tea," said Love, unimpressed. "Half the town drinks the stuff for their nerves." "Yes," Purbright agreed, "but few serve it at gatherings where gossip is the main stimulant." He thought of Miss Groom, pale and trembling, insisting she'd missed breakfast. The fainting had been real enough, but perhaps not spontaneous. Someone had wished her briefly unconscious, long enough, perhaps, to create the right moment for something to vanish. That evening, Purbright paid a visit to the drapery again. The shop was quiet, the hour late enough that only a few window shoppers remained, drawn by the pale light spilling onto the pavement. Miss Groom was at the counter, folding cloth, her movements mechanical. He spoke softly. "Still troubled, Miss Groom?" She looked up, startled, then sighed. "Only tired, sir. People have been staring all day. I keep hearing whispers when they think I'm not listening. Rumor is a persistent creature," he said. "But I've learned that if you leave it long enough, it starts quarreling with itself." Her faint smile lasted a moment. "You've found something, haven't you?" He considered how much to say. "Let's call it a curiosity. The tea you drank, it wasn't quite ordinary. There were herbs in it. Do you remember who poured your cup?" Her brow furrowed. "I did, I think. Mrs. Trimble was in the hall. I might have taken it straight from the pot. Unless—" She stopped. "No, wait." Mrs. Parsley reached across for the milk. "She might have touched the cup." Purbright's voice remained neutral. "And did Mrs. Parsley leave before you fainted?" "I can't remember," she whispered. Everything went fuzzy. He thanked her gently and left her to her duties. Outside, the drizzle had begun again, turning the cobbles slick and reflective. Street lamps glowed like small, patient eyes. At his car, Purbright paused, the faint herbal scent from the sample still clinging to his fingertips. A sedative, a fainting, and a theft perfectly timed to confusion. It could have been meant to humiliate or to remove something quietly without accusation. Either way, it required forethought and a certain intimate knowledge of everyone's habits. He drove slowly through the quiet streets, past shuttered shops and curtained windows, until the town centre clock struck 8. The sound seemed to hang in the damp air like a thought half-formed. Back at his desk, he opened his notebook again. His handwriting, spare and tidy, captured the thought that had been circling all day. Theft secondary. Purpose uncertain. Teapot symbolic. Sedative deliberate. Examine who benefits from girl's disgrace. He underlined symbolic twice. For in Flaxborough, as Purbright well knew, nothing so trivial as silver vanished without a reason, and nothing so public as a fainting fit occurred without an audience carefully chosen in advance. By Tuesday, Inspector Purbright had begun to sense the faint tightening of threads, a pattern forming not from evidence, but from tone, posture, and what was said between pauses. Welkin Street, for all its lace curtains and scrubbed steps, was a stage upon which its residents performed a daily play of respectability. The audience was everyone else, and lately that performance had grown unusually strained. He began his morning with a walk up the narrow crescent that curved behind Mrs. Trimble's house. There, modest gardens lay shoulder to shoulder like listening ears. Each gate squeaked identically. Each hedge was trimmed as if competing for moral virtue. But It was the people who interested him, the watchers behind the glass. At number 10, he paused to speak with Mrs. Blenkinsop, who had been just polishing the latch since dawn. "Oh, Inspector," she began eagerly, "you must be run off your feet. Such goings-on. I told my husband there was bound to be something behind it all. That girl, for instance, the fainting one, always looked pale. People who go about looking like that are never quite right, if you ask me." Purbright smiled. "You think Miss Groom's to blame?" "Oh, heavens no. But she attracts trouble. Same with cats, you know. Always the quiet ones that find the milk turned." He thanked her, noted the analogy, and moved along. At number 8, he met Mr. and Mrs. Trubshaw, who offered opinions in duet. Mr. Trubshaw favoured the insurance theory. Mrs. Trubshaw believed it all pointed to those letters and some long-standing jealousy. "Mrs. Trimble's been hinting for years that she's the rightful head of the Welkin Street Society," she confided. "And you know who currently holds that title, don't you?" "Mrs. Pashley," Purbright said. "Exactly. They take turns hosting the annual tea for the mayor's wife." Well, you can imagine what that means. Indeed, he could. In Flaxborough, civic tea committees wielded more authority than Parliament. A stolen teapot might easily serve as a declaration of war. His next visit was to Miss Gudgeon, the retired postmistress, who received him with the suspicion of someone accustomed to handling secrets. "You'll find," she said, folding her arms, "that all this began when Mrs. Trimble stopped taking her parcels at the counter and started using that new motor courier. I said at the time it wasn't natural. Once people start trusting machines, Inspector, they lose their grip on the moral order." Purbright, having long suspected that moral order was the first casualty of convenience, thanked her and inquired if she'd noticed anything unusual the morning of the incident. She pursed her lips. Only the vicar's cat sitting on Mrs. Trimble's wall. "A sign, if ever there was one." The inspector resisted the urge to ask of what. By midday, the drizzle had lifted, leaving behind the soft gleam of wet pavements. Purbright made his way to the church, whose porch, epicentre of earlier rumours, now hosted the vicar himself, sweeping leaves with uncharacteristic zeal. "Good morning, Inspector," the clergyman said, leaning on his broom. "I gather our community has found a new parable to discuss." "One involving tea and fainting, yes," the vicar smiled faintly. "I sometimes think sin in Flaxborough manifests itself chiefly as embarrassment. Do you have any notion of the culprit?" Purbright shook his head. "Not yet. But I suspect we are dealing less with malice than vanity, an untidy, everyday variety. The most English of motives." As he turned to leave, Purbright noticed Mrs. Pashley approaching along the path, wrapped in a fur collar that looked faintly resentful of the damp. She greeted them both, nodding at the vicar as if acknowledging a subordinate. "Inspector," she said, "I must speak plainly. This business has gone far enough. The girl's been making a spectacle of herself, crying at work, fainting in shops. If you want my opinion, she thrives on attention." Purbright's tone remained cordial. "And yet you were the one nearest her when she collapsed, weren't you?" "I was, yes. Out of concern, naturally. Though I've since wondered if she planned the whole thing. These modern girls, so dramatic," he inclined his head. "Did you happen to notice the teapot being removed?" She hesitated a fraction too long. "No, when I came back from fetching the salts, it had gone. I assumed Mrs. Holt must have tidied it away." "And you didn't see her either?" "No, but I heard the door close. That must have been her." "Perhaps." His eyes lingered a moment longer than politeness required. "I appreciate your help." That afternoon he returned to the station. Sergeant Love was examining the doctor's report again, as though it might have changed in his absence. "So the tea had sedatives, but not enough to kill." "That's something, isn't it?" "It's everything," said Purbright quietly. "Because it means the purpose wasn't harm, it was opportunity. Whoever added it knew Miss Groom would drink first. They wanted her out of the way just long enough to act." Love frowned. "Then it's someone who knew her habits. One of the women? Or someone who understood all their habits?" He reached for the evidence envelope and held it against the light. You see, love, in this little circle, everyone watches everyone else. That's their pastime. What we need to know is who expected to be watched and used that expectation as cover. Love looked puzzled. You mean someone counted on gossip to hide behind it? Purbright smiled faintly. Exactly. The cleverest trick in Flaxborough isn't silence. It's letting others make so much noise that truth sounds dull by comparison. At 5 o'clock, he stepped once more into the street. Lamps were flickering on, the air faint with coal smoke and frying onions. Somewhere nearby, a radio played a waltz that made the evening seem deceptively peaceful. As he walked past number 12, he saw Mrs. Trimble at her window again, gazing out with a theatrical sorrow that might have been rehearsed. Across the street, Mrs. Pashley's curtain twitched, then stilled. Between them, Miss Groom's lodging house stood dark and unremarkable, an island between storms. Purbright paused, watching the triangle of houses, the invisible tension that hummed like static in the air. The teapot might have been silver, but the motive was certainly not. Vanity, jealousy, perhaps even fear, metals less noble but far more durable. He noted the time in his pocketbook, 6 minutes past 5, and wrote beneath it, with quiet precision, all three were watching the same window. Only one expected to be seen. Then he closed the book, and the sound of the clasp echoed softly, like the sealing of an envelope whose contents would not remain secret for long. The next evening, as twilight folded over Flaxborough, Welkin Street held that peculiar stillness that comes when gossip runs out of breath but not out of listeners. Curtains glowed faintly against the last of the light, and the town's domestic orchestra, the rattle of cutlery, the faint whine of radios, played its nightly symphony of routine. Yet, in the hush between those familiar sounds, something less ordinary began to stir. At precisely 7:30, a figure paused at the gate of number 12. It was not the postman, nor any of Mrs. Trimble's regular visitors. The man wore a dark coat, his hat pulled low, and he stood a moment as though confirming that he was indeed expected. Then, after a cautious glance around, he slipped through the gate and knocked softly at the door. Mrs. Trimble opened it a fraction. What passed between them, words, a look, or merely silence, was not seen, though the neighbour at number 10, polishing her hallway mirror, later swore she heard voices of a serious nature. The man was admitted. The door closed, and for nearly 20 minutes. The only sign of life within was the faint flicker of lamplight moving across the parlour curtains. When the man finally left, he carried nothing in his hands, but moved with the briskness of someone whose business had been both unpleasant and unfinished. He turned the corner at the end of the street and was gone. An hour later, as the rain began again, Mrs. Trimble's house went suddenly dark. Then a sharp sound, glass breaking, cut through the quiet. The constable on evening patrol found her 5 minutes after the noise, standing by her front window in a state of theatrical shock. A small pane had been shattered, and on the carpet below lay a folded sheet of paper weighed down by a stone. "I was terrified," she cried, as the constable entered. "Someone threw it right through. Oh, Inspector Purbright must be told at once." The note, once unfolded, contained only 6 words, scrawled in thick pencil. "Stop asking. You've been warned." By the time Purbright arrived, she had recounted the incident twice, once to the constable and once to the neighbours who had found excuses to drift in. He listened without interruption, examining the paper, the stone, the glass fragments glinting on the rug. "The handwriting," she declared, "is obviously that of a criminal. You can tell by the pressure." "Possibly," said Purbright, "though in my experience most handwriting looks guilty when written in a hurry." He turned the page toward the lamplight. The words were uneven, uncertain, perhaps deliberately so. The pencil strokes, however, were firm and familiar in their rhythm. "Have you any idea what this might refer to?" he asked. Mrs. Trimble hesitated just long enough to seem thoughtful.
None whatsoever, unless. No, it's absurd. Nevertheless, said Purbright, absurdities are often instructive. Well, she said, lowering her voice, the gentleman who called earlier.
He was a relative of poor Ivy Groom's. Said he wanted to discuss her situation, how unfairly she'd been treated. He was most unpleasant. I told him I had no influence over gossip, but he said I'd started it all. And then he stormed out. I suppose this must be his revenge? Did he give a name? Something beginning with R. I hardly listened. People who shout lose the right to introductions. Purbright nodded, pocketed the note, and studied the broken pane.
He threw this after leaving?
I assume so, unless it was another of his sort. Later, outside in the wet street, Purbright paused under a lamp. The note felt damp in his pocket, the lead faintly smudged. He glanced toward the neighbouring houses. Several curtains twitched, late-night audiences to the continuing drama. But one window across the road remained still. Miss Groom's lodging house. No light showed, no shadow moved. The next morning he visited the drapery before opening hours. Miss Groom arrived early, clutching an umbrella like a shield. She looked pale, but her eyes held a new firmness, as though something fragile had hardened overnight. I know about the visitor, Purbright said quietly. A man came to see Mrs. Trimble last night. Her lips parted slightly.
My brother, she whispered.
Oh, I told him not to. He promised he wouldn't make trouble.
I never thought he'd go there. Do you think he threw the note?
She shook her head vehemently.
No, he wouldn't. He talks big, but he's not cruel.
If he'd wanted to frighten anyone, he'd have used words, not windows. Yet someone did, and someone knew he was there. She frowned, the lines of worry deepening. Then it was meant to look like him.
To make me look worse, Purbright's voice softened.
That seems likely. Tell me, has anyone been kind to you since all this began? She hesitated. Mrs. Lintop brought me a pie, but she also asked how I really managed that morning. I don't think she believed my answer. People rarely believe what would leave them nothing to discuss, he said. By the time he returned to the station, Sergeant Love had compiled a list of residents who claimed to have seen the stranger. 3 placed him at the gate, 2 claimed he lingered after leaving, and 1, naturally, swore he vanished into thin air. Love, said Purbright, thin air is popular with witnesses because it doesn't argue back. Cross-check the man's description with the drapery clerk's records. See if anyone matching it collected wages on Friday. Think he's local? I think he exists, Purbright replied, which already puts him ahead of most of our suspects. That evening, as Purbright sat alone in his office, the rain returned, steady and persistent, tapping against the window like a clock with no intention of stopping. The note lay before him on the desk, beside the sealed envelope of herbal tea leaves. He read the message again, 6 words, sharp and deliberate. Whoever wrote it hadn't just wanted to frighten Mrs. Trimble. They wanted to warn her, but of what? He looked at the smudge of graphite near the edge of the page and thought of something almost absurdly small. A pinch of tea left on a sill, a letter unsigned, a feint timed to perfection. Someone in Flaxborough had been brewing more than tea. He closed his notebook, the soft click of the clasp punctuating the quiet room. Outside in the gathering dark, the lamps of Welkin Street flickered once, as though acknowledging that its secrets were no longer entirely its own. By midweek, the affair of the missing teapot and its surrounding drama had aged just enough to acquire a varnish of respectability. People now spoke of it with an air of seasoned wisdom, as though they had all along expected precisely such developments. Only Inspector Purbright seemed to find the matter less settled with each passing hour. He sat at his desk that morning, reviewing the scattered evidence, letters, notes, fragments of gossip distilled into statements, and thought how peculiarly English crimes were. They seldom sprang from greed or hatred in their rawest forms, but from manners stretched too far, politeness used as both disguise and weapon. Somewhere in this case, he felt, someone had been unforgivably polite. The note to Mrs. Trimble remained the most curious piece. The message itself was crude, but its timing had been perfect. It arrived just when suspicion might have begun to drift away from her. That required not only malice but understanding of habits, tempers, and precisely how the town breathed. Such understanding came only from within. At 9:30, Sergeant Love appeared with the morning's gossip disguised as information. "Word is, sir, that the drapery girl's been called up to the council office. Mrs. Pashley says she's going to clear the air, though what that means I couldn't say." Purbright gave a small sigh. In Flaxborough, clearing the air usually involves kicking up more dust. Still, we should attend. They found the meeting already underway in the council office, where Mrs. Pashley, Mrs. Trimble, and the ever-loyal Mrs. Lintott had gathered around a table like a tribunal of weary saints. Miss Groom stood by the window, pale but composed. "My dear," Mrs. Pashley was saying with lofty sympathy, "no one wishes you ill, but surely you must see how this continued mystery reflects on you. The fainting, the letters, your brother's outburst, it all creates an atmosphere." "I can't help other people's imaginations," said Miss Groom quietly. Mrs. Trimble sniffed. "No one's accusing you, dear, but you must admit the whole thing is unfortunate. And if you knew anything about the teapot, anything at all, it would be far better to say so." Purbright, stepping forward unseen till then, said mildly, "Forgive me, ladies, it seems an odd place to conduct a police matter, though I must say it's generous of you to save me the trouble." The effect was immediate. Mrs. Pashley coloured faintly. Mrs. Trimble pressed her handkerchief to her chest. Miss Groom looked relieved, and perhaps a little amused. "Inspector," Mrs. Pashley began, "we were merely attempting to preserve harmony. You understand how delicate these things can be." "Perfectly," said Purbright, "though I've found harmony is seldom improved by adding a fourth voice." He turned to Miss Groom. "You may go. Miss Groom, I believe these ladies will manage very well without you." When the door closed behind her, Purbright leaned on the table. "Now, Mrs. Trimble, perhaps you'll tell me why someone would wish to frighten you into silence." She looked at him, startled.
"Silence?
"About what?" "I could not say. But the note suggests that you have been asking questions."
Have you? I've simply spoken to people."
"I want my property back." "Yes," said Purbright softly. "But property can mean more than silver. Words, for instance." "You've been quite free with yours." Mrs. Trimble's face tightened. "Surely it's my duty as a citizen." "Indeed. But one must be careful which citizens one serves." He let the remark hang in the air, just long enough to make her uncomfortable, then thanked them all for their time and left. Outside, the sky was low and colourless, and the market square lay slick with rain. Purbright paused beneath the archway, lighting a cigarette he didn't intend to finish. The smoke curled upward, fragile and temporary, like reputation. That afternoon he made a small detour to the vicarage, whose mild, book-lined rooms always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and resignation. The vicar greeted him warmly and poured tea with the solemn precision of a man who believed good manners might yet redeem the species. "You've a puzzled air, Inspector," he said. "Or perhaps that's just your normal expression." "Perhaps both," said Purbright.
"Tell me, do you ever feel that civility in this town has become a kind of tyranny?"
The vicar considered.
"Ah, you mean the politeness that conceals resentment rather than eases it?"
"Yes, we suffer from that in abundance. Why, even my verger thanks me for things he despises me for." Purbright smiled faintly. "Then you'll understand my difficulty. Everyone in this matter is courteous to a fault, precisely when honesty would be more helpful. They've built their lies out of compliments, which makes them difficult to challenge," said the vicar. "Exactly. To expose malice when it's dressed as kindness, one risks seeming rude." The vicar poured more tea. "In Flaxborough, Inspector, rudeness is the only unforgivable sin." When Purbright returned to the station, he found a note waiting on his desk. It was unsigned but written in neat script. Ask who owned the teapot before Mrs. Trimble. Nothing else. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, a small smile crept across his face.
Manners and motives, he thought, both inherited.
Both capable of doing far more harm than intended. He slipped the note into his pocket, extinguished the lamp, and left the office with the quiet satisfaction of a man who finally saw the pattern forming, not yet complete, but unmistakably human in its design. It was Thursday afternoon when Inspector Purbright decided that the time had come for something resembling a test. The air in Flaxborough carried the cold brightness that follows a long rain, and the market square looked unusually scrubbed, as though the town itself had been preparing for examination. He telephoned Mrs. Pashley that morning with an invitation so polite it could not be refused. A brief talk, purely informal, and perhaps a cup of tea at the station canteen. She arrived precisely on time, draped in confidence and a faint scent of violets. Purbright received her in the modest canteen reserved for officers, where the tea was never inspiring but always strong. She surveyed the place with the delicate disgust of one unused to enamel cups and formica tables. "Do sit down, Mrs. Pashley," he said cheerfully, pouring from the chipped pot.
Sugar? "Half a spoon," she replied.
"I'm avoiding too much these days."
"One must be careful after 50, indeed."
"I've noticed that moderation is rather fashionable in Flaxborough, especially in conversation." She smiled tightly. "We value discretion, Inspector. I expect you do as well." "Oh, constantly. Though sometimes I find it conceals more than it protects. You'll forgive me if I ask directly, why did you tell Mrs. Trimble you saw her cleaner leaving that morning when you later admitted you only heard the door?" Her hand, halfway to her cup, paused. "Did I? Oh, perhaps I was mistaken. There was so much confusion, fainting and all that." "Understandable," he said mildly. "And yet you seemed quite certain at the time." "Certainty in confusion is a rare gift." She gave a small, careful laugh. "You make it sound sinister."
"Surely you don't imagine I had anything to do with that silly theft?"
Purbright stirred his own tea. "I try not to imagine anything, Mrs. Pashley, but facts do have a way of behaving like people. They gather where they're most comfortable. And lately, quite a few of them seem to enjoy your company." Her composure trembled just a little.
"Facts?"
"For instance, your fingerprints on the tea tin in Mrs. Trimble's pantry." She blinked. "Good heavens, I picked it up to read the label. I told the constable that." "Of course you did," said Purbright pleasantly. "But the tin had been moved recently, scratched around the lid, as though someone had prized it open and replaced something. Did you notice that?" Her silence was brief but telling.
"I can't say I did."
"Really, Inspector, I think you're reading too much into ordinary gestures."
"I was merely helping." "Helping whom?"
"Why, Mrs. Trimble, naturally." Helping by faintly sedating her guest, creating an ideal moment for the teapot to disappear, and then directing suspicion toward a cleaner with a history convenient for blame." The words were spoken so evenly that for a moment she didn't grasp their full weight. Then colour rose to her cheeks, slow and uneven.
"That's outrageous. You've no proof and no right to accuse me in this cafeteria."
Purbright smiled. "Quite right, Mrs. Pashley. I'm not accusing you at all. I'm only observing that people in Flaxborough sometimes confuse helpfulness with interference. It's a minor civic epidemic." She stared at him, breathing quickly, trying to discern whether the conversation was trap or jest. "If you're trying to unsettle me, you won't succeed. I've always supported Mrs. Trimble, socially, morally, and otherwise." "That's what interests me," he said softly. "Support in Flaxborough often means control. And you, Mrs. Pashley, do seem to prefer your friendships like your tea, strong enough to remind people who brewed it." For a long moment, only the tick of the clock on the canteen wall interrupted the silence. Then she stood abruptly, smoothing her gloves. "I will not be insulted by insinuations. You'll hear from my solicitor if this continues." "I hope so," Purbright said mildly. "Solicitors are often excellent conversationalists." When she had gone, he sat for a while, sipping the last of the tea. Love-entered eyebrows raised. "Well, that was quick." Did she confess? In her way, said Purbright. You can always tell when someone's guilty of something, even if you don't yet know what. He set down the cup, its rim faintly stained, and added, She didn't take the teapot herself. She's far too proud for theft, but she set the stage for it, made sure the right person fainted, the right person left, the right rumours began. Why? Because she wanted Mrs. Trimble's humiliation, not her loss. The teapot was only the means. But whoever actually took it, he said, tapping his pen on the table, that's the person who realized the drama could be used for more than social revenge. Love frowned. You mean there's another hand in it?
There always is.
Malice rarely works alone.
It needs management. He leaned back, glancing at the door where Mrs. Pashley had departed.
She'll talk tonight. People like her always do, once they've had time to rehearse indignation. I expect Mrs. Trimble will receive a visit before supper. Should we keep watch? Quietly, said Purbright. I've a feeling the next move will come not from guilt, but from fear of being seen as guilty. And that, Sergeant, is when manners finally collapse into truth. As the evening light thinned into the soft gold of late autumn, Purbright returned to his office. The canteen still smelled of overboiled tea, and the echo of Mrs. Pashley's indignation seemed to linger in the air. He took out his notebook and wrote a single line beneath the heading of the case. Pashley provoked, Trimble defensive, Groom silent, triangle closing. Then he underlined it once and added, almost as an afterthought, Tonight, the quietest one will speak. It was near dusk the following day when Inspector Purbright found himself once more at number 12 Welkin Street. The lamps along the pavement glowed with the faint blur of misted halos, and the evening air carried a stillness that seemed to pause for listening. Inside, Mrs. Trimble had lit only one lamp in the parlour, its yellow glow pooling around her as she sat very straight in a chair, too large for her frame, a porcelain figure carved from self-regard and fear. Purbright stood for a moment before speaking. You've had visitors again, Mrs. Trimble? Her hands fluttered to her lap, then folded themselves neatly, like actors waiting for their cue. Miss Pashley came. She's terribly upset about your insinuations yesterday. I told her, of course, that you were only doing your duty. Did she seem frightened? She seemed offended. Yes, said Purbright softly. In Flaxborough, that's often the same thing. He moved closer, examining the shelves where empty spaces showed the absence of the familiar ornaments he had seen on his first visit. You've been rearranging again. I thought a little change might do good.
Helps one forget unpleasantness. But the teapot's still missing. She looked away. It's hardly about the teapot anymore, Inspector. It's about reputation. That's a delicate object to polish, he said. Too much attention, and you rub the guilt right off. Something in her expression faltered, just enough for him to see the wear beneath the varnish. I'm tired of being suspected, she said, almost in a whisper.
I didn't steal it, and I didn't poison anyone's tea.
I only wanted...
She stopped, breath catching. I only wanted things to stay as they were. Purbright waited. Silence, he had learned, was a far more persuasive interrogator than words. She clasped her hands tightly, knuckles white. Mrs. Pashley was making changes. She's been trying for months to push me out of the society. She told people I'd grown forgetful, that I wasn't fit to host the mayor's tea anymore. It was cruel. And then Ivy Groom started visiting her shop after hours. They'd gossip about me. I could tell. Her voice had taken on a tremor, not of anger, but of something closer to shame. So I thought, well, perhaps a little embarrassment might remind them who they were dealing with. Something small.
A shock, nothing more. I found an old packet of herbal leaves from my cousin in London.
I'd heard they calmed the nerves. I thought if I added just a pinch to Ivy's cup, she might grow faint, and the afternoon would end quietly.
No harm done. People would forget their unkindness, Purbright said nothing.
The clock on the mantel ticked softly, each sound perfectly distinct. But when she fell, Mrs. Trimble went on, and that dreadful commotion began, everything changed. I turned to fetch a towel, and when I looked again, the teapot was gone.
I thought at first someone had moved it for safety, but no, gone. And then the letters started coming, and that awful man at the door. You mean the brother?
Her eyes widened. No, not him. The man who came before that, 2 nights earlier. He brought an envelope, no name, just said it was from a friend. Inside was a note. It said, "I know what you did with the tea. Pay me, or it will be known." Purbright regarded her quietly. "And did you pay him?"
I didn't have the money. I told him I'd think.
Then he came back last night. When I refused again, he shouted something about warnings and left. A little later, the stone came through the window. Purbright walked to the window, staring out into the dark street where lamps shimmered faintly in puddles. "A convenient sequence," he said.
And this note, do you still have it?
She hesitated, then reached into the drawer of a small writing desk. From within she drew an envelope, creased, smudged, its flap damp from anxious handling. He unfolded it, read the scrawled words, and nodded once. The handwriting matched the earlier threat. He folded it carefully. The man was bluffing. The handwriting belongs to no stranger. It's the same as that found on the anonymous letters sent to Miss Groom. Her lips parted.
Then who?
Someone who wanted both of you frightened. Someone clever enough to know that guilt and fear make obedient company. Her eyes darted to the window again, as though expecting the shape of her neighbour to appear through the mist.
You mean Mrs. Pashley?
She whispered. Purbright inclined his head slightly. "I mean that vanity, like tea, is best served hot, but revenge, Mrs. Trimble, is usually brewed cold. Mrs. Pashley used your weakness, your vanity, to set this entire performance in motion. The fainting, the theft, the notes, each act designed to place her above reproach, the very guardian of social order."
You became her unwitting accomplice. Mrs. Trimble's face seemed to shrink into itself.
"But she couldn't have taken the teapot." "She didn't need to. That was never the point. Someone else did, perhaps to sell, perhaps to settle a small debt. But Pashley ensured that when the story was told, it would be yours and Miss Groom's names that lingered on everyone's tongue." For a long moment she sat utterly still. Then very softly she said, "I suppose I deserve it?" "No," said Purbright. "You merely earned it. Deserving is something else altogether." He left her sitting in the soft light, her reflection small and still in the darkened glass of the window. Outside, the night carried a faint chill of resolution. He walked slowly back to his car, the notes folded carefully in his coat pocket. The truth, he thought, was rarely dramatic. It arrived quietly, like the cooling of a cup once too hot to hold. Sunday came softly, the kind of day that seemed to have been laundered overnight and hung out to dry above Flaxborough. The church bells began their ritual calls just after 9, their sound spreading over the town like a polite reminder that peace was expected, if not necessarily achieved. From the upper window of the police station, Inspector Purbright watched the slow procession of hats and umbrellas make its way toward the churchyard, each step measured, each greeting faintly self-conscious. Order had returned, at least on the surface. It usually did. He had not slept much. The events of the past week had left behind not tension, but a sort of wearied civility, as if the town itself had decided that too much excitement was unbecoming. The case was, in every practical sense, closed. Mrs. Trimble's confession, the matching handwriting, and a discreet interview with Mrs. Pashley the previous evening had settled the matter, or so the paperwork said. But Purbright, as was his habit, distrusted endings that arrived too neatly. There lingered in him a faint discomfort, not of evidence left missing, but of motives too human to document. In Flaxborough, guilt seldom rested entirely on one pair of shoulders. It was distributed evenly, like sugar stirred into tea, impossible to separate again. He found himself walking to Welkin Street once more, the morning mist clinging faintly to his coat. The place looked perfectly ordinary now, Mrs. Blenkinsop watering her geraniums, Mr. Trubshaw polishing the step, Miss Gudgeon collecting her milk with the rigid posture of the morally alert. And there, in the window of number 12, sat Mrs. Trimble, back in her accustomed position, a tea tray before her, and the familiar air of injured dignity restored. When she saw Purbright approach, she rose at once, smoothing her dress and opening the door before he could knock.
"Inspector!"
"You must come in. It's all so much calmer now, isn't it? I've been thinking, perhaps it's best we draw a line under the whole unpleasant affair." He followed her into the parlour, noting the faint smell of furniture polish and the discreetly replaced china. The teapot had returned, not the original, of course, but a substitute of polished brass, shining brighter than its predecessor ever had. "I see you've acquired a replacement," he said. "One must move on, mustn't one? And besides, people expect a certain standard when they visit. Mrs. Pashley is hosting the mayor's tea next month, so naturally I can't allow her to appear the sole mistress of refinement. I imagine she'll be relieved to hear that," said Purbright. Mrs. Trimble smiled, though her eyes flickered uneasily. "She came by this morning, actually. Said she wished to make peace. I accepted, of course. Flaxborough can't stand division. We agreed to say as little as possible about the whole thing. You understand, I'm sure?" "Entirely," Purbright said.
It's what the town does best. They drank tea, the silence between them polite, but taut.
When he rose to leave, she followed him to the door and said, with a strange, tentative gentleness, "Inspector, do you think people will ever stop talking?" He considered her for a moment. "No, Mrs. Trimble, but they'll talk about something else soon enough." She seemed oddly comforted by that. Outside, the sun had broken through, casting mild light across the cobbles. Purbright walked toward the churchyard, where the bells had given way to the drone of the organ. Along the path he passed Miss Groom, dressed neatly and walking beside her brother. She looked brighter now, her colour returned, though the stiffness of her smile betrayed an unease that time would take to smooth. She stopped when she saw him.
"Inspector," she said quietly.
"I wanted to thank you for being fair." "I did very little," he said. "The truth in Flaxborough usually insists on being found. It simply prefers to arrive late." Her brother nodded. "We're leaving next week."
"Ivy's been offered a position in Ely. It's best, I think." Purbright smiled faintly.
"Ely's very peaceful. You'll find they gossip more slowly there." They laughed, though not entirely with humour, and went on their way. By the time he reached the church gate, the last hymn was ending. Through the open doors drifted the scent of flowers and candle wax and a chorus of dutiful voices rising toward the rafters. He paused there a moment, listening. Flaxborough at that hour sounded almost innocent. Later, back at the station, the day folded into its quiet routines. Love was at his desk, finishing the final report.
"All wrapped up then, sir?"
he asked. "As neatly as it's likely to be," Purbright replied. He sat down, took up his pen, and signed the file without flourish. Then, after a moment's thought, he added a final note at the bottom of the page. "Motives mixed.
Manners intact."
Recommend no further action." Love looked up. "You don't think it'll happen again?" "Oh, it will," said Purbright. "Not this story, but another. Different characters, same stage."
"There's something about this town. It dislikes emptiness."
"If virtue doesn't fill it, vanity will." Love grinned faintly. "At least we'll never be short of work." Purbright closed the file. "No, love, not while there's tea, silver, and human nature in circulation." The office fell quiet. Outside, the bells began again for evensong, their sound drifting faintly through the open window. Purbright sat for a while, listening, watching the last of the day's sunlight fade across the tiled floor. Then, with a small sigh that might have been contentment or resignation, he reached for the next stack of papers, minor complaints, petty disputes, the soft machinery of a town that never truly slept. And somewhere, beyond the steady hum of routine, Welkin Street resumed its tranquil rhythm, gossip settling like dust, forgiveness worn like an ornament, and Mrs. Trimble, poised once more beside her shining new teapot, pouring civility back into its proper cups.